NEK-TV and Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Joy Sullivan. Our featured guest today is Ben Kinsley, always somebody we welcome to join us where we get it straight. Welcome, Ben. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Linda. Thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
Oh, we always adore having you on because you're so informative, you're so knowledgeable about what's going on up at the State House, and your articles are always open to great fact finding. And, we know you do research, so it's not just shooting from the hip. And I
Mm.
saw your latest article that came out on Campaign for Vermont, and I was intrigued. So I wanted to talk about it. And we're talking about the working group for Act 73. And before we get into some of the questions you raised and who the people are, is it possible for you to give our listeners a little history about Act 73 or what's going on with it? Are you up for that?
Yeah, absolutely. This
Great.
is a piece of legislation that we followed very closely this past legislative session, and folks may be most familiar with it as the Education Reform Bill. Sort of started out with Governor Scott's, 5 school district proposal, and the financing proposal that moved us to a foundation formula, which most states use for education funding. Follow that very closely, but even going back further than that, this is something that Campaign for Vermont has been following for over a decade now. I was personally involved in Act 46 and that piece of legislation, or at least the conversations leading up to it. I didn't necessarily approve of the final work product, but we were part of the process that led
And
to
Act
that.
46 was the original merging of the schools. And if I remember correctly, and please correct me if I'm not remembering correctly, the any schools that decided not to merge, the education Secretary of Education could turn around and mandate that they did merge. And
Yeah,
at
the
the point in time, that was Secretary Rebecca Holcomb at the
when it
time.
finally, yeah, the final maps were drawn, it was Secretary Holcomb was
And we'll get onto that because she's one of the appointees for this new
she
committee.
is.
So it was going to be interesting when we go down through the different people and we get
Yeah.
to her.
And I would say there's a couple consolidation efforts even before Act 46. Act 156 in 2010 was the original, what actually predated Act 46 and offered merger incentives, but didn't force mergers. Act 46 provided a stronger incentive for mergers, voluntary mergers, but then also, if you were choosing not to merge, you basically had to go to the State Board of Education and try to justify your reasoning for not merging. And the way that played out is most of the time, the State Board of Ed and the Secretary of Education chose to merge districts, even when they were not enthusiastic about doing it themselves. So there's very few exceptions to that. We went through in Act 46. We went from 100 and almost 280 districts down to 120 districts. So it's pretty
Right.
significant consolidation. And when you're talking about districts, you're really talking about the local school boards that oversee schools. And and a school board, may oversee 2, 3, 4 schools that comprise the district. And so really what happened during Act 46 is we consolidated school boards, those administrative oversight aspects of schools. Um, and that's in a lot of ways what Act 73 does. But Act 73 has some key differences. First, we're talking about, something like we're going to have 10 to 20 based on the sort of parameters in the bill, 10 to 20 administrative districts statewide. That could be school boards and districts. It could be supervisory unions. There is some flexibility in the language about what that actually means in terms of that. But there's going to be somewhere between 10 and 20 administrative districts. So not all the way down to 5 like the governor had proposed, but somewhere in the middle of that range.
And that's what Act 73 says at this point in time. It doesn't
Correct.
mean that it can't be amended at any point in time.
Right. It can always be changed. The maps are not drawn. And that is one of the significant differences between Act 73 and Act 46. Act 46 was largely driven by local community leaders, like trying to figure out. I mean, there were like a dozen or so like forced mergers, but for the most part, it was neighbors looking at each other and saying, how do we combine in a way that makes sense? Um, Act 73 does not follow that model. It is going to be a map that is drawn at the statewide level that says, no, here is the new configuration of school administration. There's obviously going to be some feedback from, the state and the public at large, but the effort is going to be directed by the state.
So the big difference is that Act 46 was more on people-driven, local municipalities driven because they identified a need, and now it is going to be state driven where they identify the financial need as well as what they've identified as the need for better education for our people here in the state of Vermont.
Yeah, there's sort of a built-in assumption in both Act 46 and Act 73 that bigger is better, both for a financial reason and for a quality of education reason. So there's sort of that built-in incentive, but we've raised the flag a couple times to say the data doesn't actually bear that out. When we did a regression analysis in 2014, and we actually just redid it and updated it last year, looking at all of the available public school data in Vermont, and actually there's no statistical indication that larger districts or even larger schools for that matter perform better on a cost basis or a performance basis. So we
Right.
have small schools that are very high performing that have a very good cost ratio, and we have large schools that have a high cost per student and not performing very well. And so like it's all across the board. So I think we should be questioning this built-in assumption of bigger is better, and maybe focus on better is better.
Okay, and the pupil performance is, of course, should be the top priority. Cost is always going to be in there, and you can't ignore it.
Right.
But we do need to see how it also is affected by, the teachers as well,
Yeah,
and what's going on with the requirements for teaching in the state. I mean,
absolutely.
that also is a huge influence on how the performance is going to happen as well as cost savings. But, do you say teacher qualifications are allowed to be lowered for a while until they get to a certain level, or do you say you must be highly licensed and then you get to come on in and teach? So there are
Well,
all these elements that are out there. Go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, like, and then we sort of did that during COVID a little bit. We
Right.
had a wave of teacher retirements, and so schools were trying to fill these open positions, and there weren't enough licensed qualified teachers to fill it to just step into those roles. So what they did during COVID is they, brought on folks on provisional teaching licenses, which basically says we're bringing you on as a teacher with the expectation that at some point in the future you get your qualifications. And we still have a lot of those people that are on provisional licenses today. And when we look nationally, the research is very clear that the number one thing that impacts student outcomes is the quality of the teacher.
Of course.
And it's not cost, it's not how much money you throw at the problem, it's not class sizes, it's how good is the teacher that is in the front of the classroom. And so we have, interestingly, in Vermont, we have seen over the last decade, really actually since Act 46 started to be implemented, we saw an acceleration in the cost per student. And we can get into why that is. Why would consolidation in larger school districts actually lead to higher costs? And there's some reasons for that. But then also, we've seen a decline in student outcomes. Like our student outcomes have been declining for a decade now. And some people, if you point that out, say, "Oh, it was COVID and whatnot." It started years before COVID, like 5 years
Correct.
before COVID. Certainly, accelerated a little bit during COVID, and that was a national trend we saw everywhere. But if you look at Vermont's scores, we even during COVID, our scores dropped a larger percentage than the country as a whole. So there's, and they were declining before COVID too. So like, we have a structural problem in terms of, the teaching staff that we have. We have the smallest class sizes in the country, and not even by a little bit. It's by a mile. And there's very little research that indicates class sizes that small actually benefit students. Most of the research and this sort of surprised us when we started looking at it. In fact, there's statistically in Vermont, our schools that have the largest class sizes actually perform better than our
Well,
smallest.
and there's the larger interaction with other students. That
Exactly.
is a vital part of education.
Yeah.
Is not just a handful of students, being isolated in a classroom. But we'll get into that after I really want to talk about it. Is there anything else on Act 73 specific you want to talk about before we get into who was appointed?
So I'd say there is two aspects to Act 73 that are really important, and one of them really differs significantly from Act 46. So there's this, governance structure piece that we've talked about. Act 46 was totally focused on governance. Act 73 also has a big governance component because it's saying we're going from the 120 school districts, which used to be the 280 school districts in 2010. We're going down to 10 to 20 of them, whatever these administrative districts are, and it's being decided by the state. It's being driven by the state. It's not being driven by local communities. So there's that aspect of it. The other really big thing that Act 73 did, which in my opinion might actually be more impactful long term, is changing the financing structure, so
Right.
that you get a X number of dollars per student provided by a statewide education tax. And you can choose, under the current configuration, you can choose to spend as a local district a little bit more if you want to, if you feel like you need that for your students. But instead of this like free for all system that we have today, which sort of creates a tragedy of the common situation where my spending can stay the same, right? Today's current financing system, I can choose not to spend any more money, but if my neighbor chooses to spend more money, my taxes are still going up, and that is a problematic situation. And legislators have acknowledged at this point that it's a system that doesn't work, and so we're adopting this foundation formula model, which 36 other states follow. Vermont's is a little different, of course. We have to be a little different than everyone else, so there are some differences. But those are the two big things that Act 73 does, and we can kind of dive into the pros and cons of those, and what's going
So
on.
the governor's recommend was for 5 districts,
Five
and
districts, yeah.
right, and the current Act 73 says that like almost 15, 20, whatever it might be, right? Do
Yeah.
you take that as, was there any identification of factual statistics there for that, or is it just we're not going to do it because it's a political game?
So there's a couple things going on there. So the 5 district proposal was based on, um, you know, average district size in terms of number of students that we see in other states. And so they were like, well, yeah, 20 to 30,000 students is like, a pretty normal district size in other states. But the thing that I think the administration did not take into account is the geographic size that translates to in Vermont. I mean, you have districts that would be 80 miles across in rural parts of the state with student populations over 10,000. So like, from a local community, you think about this, like today, even, you have a problem, you're a parent, you have a problem with your kid in school, you're not getting traction with any of the school administrators, you take that issue to the school board, and more often than not, you're going to get traction with the school board. Well, now, if you're going down to like 5 school boards in the state, you've got to drive 50 miles and get in line behind the parents of 20 other thousand kids that may have some like other issues. And so that scale is a little problematic. It's too large, I think, was the recognition from the
Do you
legislature.
think, though, that people actually looked and did an analysis of the type of issues that were out there being brought to the school boards? And when is it just, my Johnny doesn't like potatoes today? So, or is, I mean, did they actually look at what these issues were by the parents?
There's never been a quantitative analysis of it. I think one of the things that we know is pretty pervasive in Vermont schools is bullying. There's a lot of kids that
Hmm.
get bullied, and school administrators are not always responsive to that. Like we hear a lot of stories about that. And those issues do get raised with school boards oftentimes to say like, I need my kid to go to a different school because this environment is now toxic to them, and that's a decision at the school board level more often than not.
Okay, bullying, right? And also, what about the fact? Well, I don't want to get that's like another whole show, but I'm just saying, like the bullying aspect and getting the school administration side to actually be more educated in that area and take responsibility and become accountable and actually participate in what they need to do to make sure that the bullying stops.
Yes. And I would also say too that, when you get school boards that are in charge of too many schools, you start losing focus on certain things. Like, if you even at like you think about it, if you're on a school board and you have 5 schools even in your district, trying to make sure that all 5 schools are performing at the level they should is a fairly tall order. And then you think about scaling that up to you have 100 schools in your district. Like there's no way that you're going to be able to ensure as a school board member that those schools are performing the way that they should.
Right. And then, of course, the members of the school board are appointed, elected. So, where
Hmm.
are they coming from? And that's going into what your article was about. You raised a lot of questions. Can you throw some of those questions out here? And then
Sure.
I'd like to go through some of the people who were appointed and hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions to ask. So this task force that Act 73 created is going to draw the initial maps for what the new school governance structure is going to look like. And so this is, if you'll recall, there was a previous working group that was supposed to do this called the Commission on the Future of Education. They were supposed to come back with some recommendations
And
last
what
year.
happened?
They failed to do that. They had no.
But was there a reason why they failed, or they just said, we're not playing?
So I think there's a couple reasons. One is that group was almost completely made up of school administrators, and I think it was hard for them to get to a consensus on something that was going to impact their operating structure. And most of them were current administrators, so they had a current district that they were responsible for, or a supervisory union that they were responsible for. And
And
so
a
I think
financial vested interest
and a
in their
financial
own
vested
area.
interest. Exactly. So I think that there were too many conflicting interests, or too many interests that were served by the current system, for them to come to a consensus around what the future system should look like. This new task force avoids some of those pitfalls. It is not all school administrators, although there are a couple on there. And the administrators that are on there are retired administrators, some of them recently retired, very recently in a couple cases. But they're not currently responsible for a specific district or supervisory union in the state. And so that
So
is
what
already
happened to them? Is it gone? Are they no
the,
longer in existence, or do they still have some authority?
the commission.
Hmm.
Yeah, the commission still exists, although the chair and a couple prominent members just resigned
Resign.
a couple months ago.
Hmm.
Um, and they do have a mandate to come back with some other recommendations now. So they're not completely gone, but they definitely got some of the keys taken away from them. And the charter for this new task force is much more specific. It's like, it's not just come forward with a plan to address this broad range of issues, it's bring us a map. And you can bring 3 for what these administrative structures are going to look like, but you need at least 1 and not more than 3 is basically what the charge is for this task force.
So is the commission now over the task force, or is the commission not even affiliated with the task force, or
Not
are we going
affiliated.
to nothing?
Yeah. So you have like multiple things happening now, because there's
Right.
the State Board of Education, which has always kind of existed. They have a couple things that they're supposed to be looking at. The commission, which again is mostly school administrators, made up of school administrators, they have a couple things they're supposed to be doing, but their authority and honestly, in a lot of ways, their legitimacy is pretty reduced. And then there's this third structure, the task force, and they're all not affiliated with each other, except for the fact that the Agency of Education is supposed to be supporting them. Is
Right.
really the only thing that ties them together, is that the agency is supposed to be giving them resources to do their jobs, basically.
So we have 3 silos.
3 silos. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we know how I feel about silos, so I'm not
Yes.
going to get into that.
Weird situation.
But throw out some of these questions that you raised, and then we'll look at some of the people who are actually on this working group and who put them there.
That is a great question. I think so some of the questions we asked, and it's sort of like looking at historical working groups that have been put together around education, and most recently the Commission on the Future of Education. Things like what do we know about the people who are serving on this task force? What solutions are they going to try to put forward? Is there someone that is there that is advocated for a certain thing? Are there multiple people that have advocated for that certain thing? And really the most important question though is like, whose interests are they going to represent? Are they going to represent school administrators' interests? Are they going to represent the interests of students? And this is an interesting thing, because I've been in the State House a long time, as I know you've also been in the State House for a long time. And a lot of these groups that represent school administrators and teachers and other staff members say they're focused on the kids, but when push comes to shove, it's really about their membership, right? So they talk a good game right up until
Action time.
Exactly. So one of the questions is, are there going to be any voices around the table that are truly watching out for kids and what's best for them? Are there people around the table that are going to be paying attention to taxpayers and putting taxpayers in the front seat, and understanding what that impact is going to be on taxpayers? What about local communities, folks who are interested in maintaining strong connections between schools and their communities, which we're understanding from national and regional research is really actually quite important, both for the community and for the school, to have that strong community connection. So there are going to be people in the room that are paying attention to that. Are there going to be people in the room that are paying attention to small rural communities, to make sure they're not going to be trampled by larger communities in the way that those votes are combining? We've seen some of that in Act 46 already.
Right.
Merge a small town with a couple big towns, and then a couple of years later, the big towns are like, well, we don't want to pay for that small school, so we're going to vote to close it. And there's nothing that smaller town can do, because they're merged into a larger town that has more votes than they do. So even if there's nothing wrong with that school from a performance standpoint, they can still be overridden. So
what's your thought then on the fact that this task force actually has legislators on it?
I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing because at the end of the day, legislators are accountable to their communities,
So aren't they accountable to their communities in the fact of their elected position? And so shouldn't that be separate and apart from a task force that might require more doctors who are licensed in these areas? And then the legislators can battle it out on the floor as opposed to putting, and this is just a question, okay,
Yeah.
putting it together and then saying, okay, now we've got what we want to go forward. So I always have issues with legislators being on any of these boards and commissions because that's not
Yeah.
their role, in my opinion. I think they belong outside in where their seat is, where they're elected, and that's the best place for them to argue and defend and really make law. But so you're okay with it here. So give me
Yeah,
a
I
little
think
more
I
input.
think so, because I think you need diversity of perspectives. Like sometimes you see on these like summer study committees, for example, they're all made up of legislators, and I
I
think that is
understand that pay for that, right?
yes, and they get stipends and all kinds of stuff, and and I think that is maybe not the best use of resources because it's basically a committee, right? A basically legislative committee that's meeting over the summer and they're getting paid to do so. And are you really getting any more valuable perspective out of that process? I think this one is different because it's not all legislators. There's a couple legislators on there, but it's not controlled by legislators. And those legislators do have valuable experience in their local communities and in schools. And I think they can kind of bring some of those different perspectives of here's how my community feels about this. And I've worked on education legislation, in the state house, so they can kind of tie like what's the legislative conversations are, and they can kind of bridge that gap a little bit. So I think
Can't
it's
they do that at testimony?
they could, yeah, but I think if you're going to get a good working product that's politically viable, um, as well as as well as makes policy sense, I think there is value in having a couple legislators in there to help um, inform that process.
And what's the balance when it comes to the votes of that task force? Are there more non-legislators who would control the vote, or are the legislators the power that controls the vote?
Yeah, one of the things I like about this task force is that there's no one sort of set of interest groups that really can control the vote. So there's not a group of the legislators do not hold a majority. There's four of them out of an 11 person. I think this is an 11-person committee. Um, and so there's four of them. They don't have a majority. The school administrator group also does not have a majority. And so you have to be able to combine a couple different.
Except if you have two from the administration and you have four legislators and their goal is to do this, they have a
Yes.
goal to force it, they do
So
have the majority vote.
if the representatives of the administration and the legislators, and I think they would need one more vote. So if they could convince one other person, they would then have a majority. The same is true for the school administrators, though. If the school administrators, they also have four reps on the commission or on the task
Mhm.
force. So if the school administrators and the state administration, like AOE and the governor's appointee, teamed up, they would have a majority voting block if they could convince maybe one other person.
But we've
So
seen, unless I misunderstood, that didn't work.
it didn't work when it was only school administrators because they had one perspective that they were bringing to the table. I think this particular task force forces multiple perspectives. So you have the state administration and the agency of education, which is, they put their plan out there. They want to see as much consolidation as possible. And they are definitely focused on taxpayers, maybe less focused on outcomes, although the Secretary of Education has talked more about outcomes, I think, than the last three that I've seen. So that's something. Um,
So
and
let's
then,
look at some of the people after you go through. Do you
sure.
have any more of the questions you want to throw out there that you
No, I think
raised?
those are the big ones. Like whose interests are a lot of these folks? representing, and what kind of outcome can we expect when, what kind of map could we expect them to draw based on those interests that they're bringing to the table.
So one of the representatives who is on here is Representative Rebecca Holcomb
Yeah.
from Norwalk, right? Democrat from Norwalk, right? Is
Yep,
that correct?
she's a state rep from Norwich, and she was a former Secretary of Education. She
Who
now
resigned?
Who resigned, and she presided over a lot of the Act 46 consolidations. She was in office at that time, and then ran against Governor Scott when she resigned from being Secretary of Education.
And when she ran against Governor Scott, her position on education versus his position on education, are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I mean, this was several years ago now. There were definitely differences, and I'm not sure I could recall
Not
offhand
that
what they
this is
were.
bad. I'm just trying to figure
Yeah,
out what's going on here.
yeah. I think that there were definitely differences of opinion between Holcomb and Scott in terms of like what the balance between the resources we're providing versus the cost. And we know today, that we have the second costliest education system in the country, on a cost per student basis. We spend more than anyone else except for New York. And the only reason New York spends more is because they pay their teachers better.
Pay the teachers better, right?
So, which is maybe a model we should look at is,
Follow.
yeah,
But they
fewer.
also have higher licensing requirements and they're highly regulatory.
Yeah. And so
It's
there's trade-offs. But I think, kind of on the heels of our previous argument about the quality of teachers and how small our class sizes are, I think there's a good argument to say we need to reduce overall staffing, but pay the staffing we do have better and ask more of them.
So with Representative Holcomb, looking at her, she's definitely merger oriented. It's
Mhm.
just a matter of where she's going to go with the administration's plan, and is she going to be able to keep politics out of it and focus on literally, what is best for the education system? What is her opinion or her position with the new Secretary of Education? I mean, there's a lot of politics going on here.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too, and because she was secretary during the Act 46 mergers, and because, but she's also balancing that with she's in a fairly rural part of the state, so I don't know exactly, to be honest, how she's going to
Right.
approach mergers, and like she's going to go big, go small, somewhere in between, and
And we're
she's
going
all,
to invite them all on here to
yeah,
answer all of
absolutely
these
do that.
questions. That's the goal here, is that we want to do round two, having them here so we can hear from them personally, and, they may not know. At this stage, they may go, we don't know. We just
Yeah,
know that we're there earnestly ready to do the right thing. And I do believe that. I believe that every single one of these people start out earnestly with wanting a good goal. However, where does the politics and who appointed you and what the outcome is and the deals, etc., where does that actually play when it
yeah.
comes down to the finality of what this task force is assigned to do?
Exactly. And what are your local interests, and you're part of the state. And one of the ones that's really interesting for Holcomb is that she's been, as a legislator, an outspoken opponent of town tuitioning,
Right.
the town tuitioning system and independent schools. And but she's also got tuitioning districts within tuitioning towns within her district, as a legislator. So that's an interesting juxtaposition when it comes to drawing new maps that are going to impact the footprint of town tuitioning, and which towns are going to have the choice to send their kids where they want versus operating a school. So that's going to be a really interesting outcome. And then on the other side of that, you also have another legislator on the committee is Senator Scott Beck, who
Right.
is from St. Johnsbury, teaches at St. Johnsbury Academy, And his community is heavily invested in town tuitioning, and you can probably imagine that he's going to be a strong advocate for defending tuitioning where it exists today. So you have, and then you have, a couple other legislators, like that are kind of mixed. It's a mixed bag. Some of them are in favor of town tuitioning and will defend it, and others won't. And then, it's a very interesting mix in terms of that particular issue. And obviously we saw that one flare at the end of the legislative
At the
session.
end of the list, right? Are you familiar with Representative Beth Quimby from Linden? Are you? She's a Republican from Linden. Are you familiar with her position?
I am not super familiar with her position.
She's a
Or
retired middle school teacher,
Mhm,
is what
yes.
right? Is that correct? Yeah, and
Retired
so
middle school teacher, and given that she's from Linden, and there's Linden Institute, another independent school that receives town tuitioning kids, I would imagine she would be an advocate for town tuitioning. So she would probably be aligned with Scott Beck on that
that,
particular issue.
and
Yeah.
then we have uh, a couple of outside people. We have, and I'm not familiar with this particular person, Chris Locarno. Are you a retired director of finance of the Central Vermont Supervisory Union? I mean, I personally have never I don't believe spoken to that person, but we intend on it. But are
Yeah.
you familiar with what that will kind of do to the balance here?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting, where the finance people land on this.
Hmm.
There is so one of the things that we have to balance with mergers. There's going to be some administrative cost savings at some level when you level up things like business offices and whatnot, right? That's where, when you're talking about mergers, it's the HR functions, it's bulk purchasing. Those are where the savings are. But then you also have costs on the other side, um, where you go to larger business entities and you've got to level up staffing contracts, right? You combine three different school districts, just for sake of argument. It's going to be very difficult to convince your teachers to take anything other than the highest paid contract in those previous three districts. So you end up having to level up your teachers to the most generous teacher contract in that previous set of districts. That's what we saw during.
Do you think that will force the higher licensing credentials to happen, or do you think they'll just get the better contract and they'll still be able to do these provisional, provisional credential certifications or whatever they're allowed to do?
Only if there's staffing reductions, and we didn't see that in Act 46, and there's no reason to expect it here as well. Or not much of a reason to expect it here as well. So I think that, when you're looking at those things, the folks who are in the finance aspect, I think, are going to be hopefully focused on that aspect of mergers, where, okay, do the administrative cost savings from going to a bigger district offset the staffing costs that come along with it? And those are the questions I would expect the business administrator folks to be looking at, because the math didn't end up working on Act 46 the way that was implemented. So it's like, we hear political talk about right sizing our education system, but what does that actually mean at the end of the day? And does right sizing increase, generate cost savings, or generate better outcomes? And so far, bigger is not proven to be better.
So, what about Kim Gleason, who is actually on the Vermont State Board of Education, right? During that
She was on the state
implementation.
board. Yeah, and this is the second person on this task force that was involved in Act 46. So she was on the State Board of Education at the time that the Act 46 mergers were being approved. So she had a front row seat for this. She was one of the decision makers who said, yes, we're going to give you a waiver so you don't have to merge, or we're going to approve your merger plan or not approve your merger plan. The State Board of Education was really responsible for all of that during Act 46, and she was on the State Board of Education. So I would expect her. I don't know if she's going to come in with the perspective of, yes, we need more of this, or she's going to come in with a perspective of, okay, Act 46 didn't really have the impacts we were looking for. Do we need to be more strategic about how we do this? I don't really know what to expect from her, other than she definitely had a front row seat for Act 46, and that's going to inform her decision making in one way or another.
Right. And we don't know what way. And it doesn't mean just because we're discussing it doesn't mean it's not going to be a healthy
Right.
decision. It's just a matter of
We
we
don't.
don't know yet. And that's why we're going to invite them in to hear what they have to say. But you definitely raised the right questions in your article. And there's definitely a lot going on here. And as you said, geographical issues as well, transportation issues. I mean, uh, parenting issues, but then where do we carve out parenting at, their own lifestyle versus what's required from an educational
Right.
system? And, so we have a lot to look at here. Do you think that our current Secretary of Education is going to be a vital part of the discussions here, or is going to sit back and wait for the task force to let us know what happens?
If her engagement in the legislative process is any indication, I do expect her to engage early with the task force, put some proposals on the table. We saw that this legislative session, right? The administration came out with a plan. It was a pretty detailed plan. We can argue over the pros and cons of it, but it was a well thought through plan for the most part, well detailed, and they were not afraid to put it in front of legislators. They were out there the first week of the legislative session rolling it out. I would expect something similar, although maybe not a formal plan. I would expect principles. So they're going to come in and say, here are the principles that we as the agency of education and the administration think are really important to this process. And some of those principles are laid out in the legislation itself, in Act 73 itself. So, but
So let's talk about that. So the administration, our Secretary of Education, currently came out with her overview, and she's been quite vocal. And there was a plan, and it was a detailed plan. And now, it's a grand education transformation
yeah,
going on here. This is not, something, okay, we can do it in 30 days. This is a major historic
yes,
change,
yeah,
right?
there's no doubt.
So, there's going to be, better transparency, do you think, based on this whole task force coming out now? Do you think it's going to be behind the scenes discussions, or do you think that it will be more transparent, or do you think, are all of the meetings open to the public?
All of the formal task force meetings will be open to the public. I am certain there are going to be, closed door meetings between members.
Well, right, which is okay. That's understandable and it's fine. You should negotiate and you should talk behind the scenes to get your own questions asked and
Yeah,
answered. That's 100% appropriate. But the bottom line is, are there going to be more open meetings? So yes, there will be,
I think so.
because
Yeah.
that's the task force's charge. And that's what I'm trying to find out. What is the actual governance going on with this task force? Do you know what it is?
Yeah.
Is there a deadline for the transition of these school districts? Where
Yeah.
are we
So
on
the
this?
task force needs to provide a map, at least one, and as many as three, to the legislature before they return in January. So that is the job of the task force. They have a list of criteria that they're supposed to follow, and the the structure of the commission is such that, there's legislative appointees, there's administrative appointees, there's appointees from special interest groups in the education space, So they all kind of have like different influences over this commission or this task force, and ultimately they're going to elect two co-chairs. So the task force is going to choose from among themselves two people to co-chair the task force, and they will call the meetings and schedule that. I would imagine they're going to have to meet probably once a week or every other week, I would imagine, given the volume of work they have to do before the end of the year. Um, and they do have resources from the Agency of Education, um, and we would expect, I think, to see, you know, there's going to be at least two public hearings. So they're required to have at least two public hearings to get feedback on whatever maps they're drawing. Um, so I'd expect those to happen, you know, sometime this fall to get those.
What and the commission, and please jump in if I'm not, recalling this as accurately as I should. Wasn't there a removal from the commission itself to be able to look at integration of the career and technical education?
That is something we were able to add to the Senate version of the bill. We have a whole plan for like what model we would like to see, and it is centered around tech centers. We were able to get language into the Senate version of the bill, which did persist all the way through the final product, that says
So that is now under the new
that
task
is
force
under the new
domain.
task force domain. And actually, and I said they were required to submit at least one map, and they can submit up to three.
Mhm.
The map that they're required to submit actually looks at using supervisory unions as the governance structure instead of school districts, because that
Okay.
navigates around some of the challenges we talked about with scale and leveling up of staffing contracts. So you can get some of that administrative savings at the supervisory union level, which it was what they were designed to do originally anyway. Like supervisory unions today really function as service providers for special education, but they could do a lot more than just special education. So
And will the task force are they charged with looking at the socioeconomic development now, or was that still vested with the
that's
old
still in the old
commission?
commission. The new task force really is really focused on the governance structure component of this, and so um, one of the considerations as they're drawing maps, one of the criteria is existing district and town boundaries. So they should follow as best they can existing boundaries in our education governance structure. But also,
And class size?
class size is not explicitly in the task force. It is in Act 73. There are task force guidelines in Act 73,
Okay.
but it is not necessarily under the purview of the task force. They're more focused on what the end. Really, they have to have a map that has administrative districts with at least 4,000 students in them and not more than 8,000 students. So between 4 and 8, and that's how we get the 10 to 20 district thing, just based on.
And the finances is part of this, so that between the 4 to 8,000 students, they will have to also bring forth what the finances will be, weighted average costs, and all sorts of great accounting and finance directives. Will that be part of this task force agenda as
Yeah, so
well?
they're not responsible for like determining what what the weighting factors are going to be for that. Um, the foundation formula. There's a separate group working on that, but they are responsible.
Well, what group is that?
So I
What group is that?
believe I believe it is the State Board of Education that's working on that. I have to go back and look, but
Okay.
I think it's the State Board of Education that's working on the weighting factors component of it. But they are required to do a financial analysis to understand what the finances of these districts in their proposed maps are going to be.
So in this financial analysis, do we know what elements they've been charged with to put into this financial analysis, or are they just allowed to use the word financial analysis and then do their own thing?
There are some loose guidelines, I believe. They want to understand, like, are basically, I think what the legislature was concerned about is, like, are these maps going to group all of these, like, high poverty districts together? Like, we're going to have all of these high poverty schools and towns in, like, one district. Is there going to be like a mix, right? I think that's probably what they're looking at, more so than other things. Or are these districts that all have like extraordinary special needs situations, are those all getting grouped together? I think those are the things that the legislature is worried about, and why they're asking for that sort of like high level analysis of like, okay,
So it's not number
not
crunching itself.
necessarily.
There would be study groups maybe to do that, or
I
not
think there's
even.
going to be some interplay between the weighting factors that are being developed and the governance structures, because like the weighting factors really tell us, like, once those are finalized, what is the cost per student in that district going to be? How much money are they going to get from the state to operate? Is it going to be sufficient to operate in that district? Are they going to are those existing schools going to have to cut resources? Are they going to get extra resources? These are all sort of questions that, the legislators are going to be asking when they return in January. And then this task force will hopefully have some answers for them when that work is combined with the weighting factors work.
So does the tax commissioner weigh in on any of this?
I'm sure the tax commissioner will weigh in. I think,
But not charged at this point in time under the
no, and
act.
I think that more likely the tax commissioner is going to weigh in on the weighting factors component of it, and less so on the governance component. I think more likely
Mhm.
on the governance side of it, it's actually going to be the Secretary of State, because as you're, combining municipalities, essentially school districts or
Mhm.
municipalities, there's like proper procedures on how you do that from a public vote, public notice standpoint. And then how is the voting going to work in these new districts? Is it going to be proportional? Is it going to be at large? Is it going to be like, those are all sorts of questions that are really governance questions the Secretary of State is probably going to be involved in. So I actually think that's the more likely one. It's going to be Secretary of State and Secretary of Education.
So so there are a lot of open-ended questions that will come out of just the task force questions. And as they begin to analyze and do their analysis, many more questions will come
Totally.
forward. And there may need to be further legislation brought or further negotiations with the administration. And what about the municipalities? Are they pretty much told at this point in time, you just sit tight
Yeah,
and
pretty
wait?
much. I mean, they'll have an
Pretty much,
opportunity
right?
to weigh in the public hearings, when we get to that stage. I think this task force could meet as early as next week. So they'll have their
Oh,
first
good.
meeting. The first meeting is probably just going to be an organizational meeting. They're try to get their ducks in a row and put down a calendar and talk about work distribution and things like that. So it's not going to be, they're not going to get into meat and potatoes in their first meeting, but it could be as early as next week that they meet for the first time.
And the understanding is that they are going to meet throughout the rest of the summer, or they just get to meet once and they determine their own plan of
I
meeting,
mean, I
or
think we
we
don't
don't
know
know.
at this stage, but one of the problems that the Commission on the Future of Education had is they only met like once a month. And
Right.
and you're starting in July and you're meeting once a month and you're supposed to have a report produced by January. um, that's not a lot of work hours to go into it. I think this commission or this task force is going to have to meet much more frequently than that. I would argue maybe even once a week, if not every other week, I think is what they're going to need to do.
I would think that they would need to meet at a minimum
Yeah.
once a week. because this is serious day-to-day operations, changing an entire state's financing and policy and geographical arrangement of the education of every single student in the state of Vermont. So how you can do that from a vacation is just not
Yeah.
exactly doesn't give me the comfort level that I would want. I do believe that all of these people can get together and they can do it, but I think they need to do it. They need to sit down and take this as they made a commitment. This is their job now, and they need to do this. This isn't just, oh, hooray, I was put on a task force, look at me. Okay, this is get in there and work. And I believe from the people I've seen on here that they believe that too.
I think so.
And we will hear from them. But of course, it's difficult when you're asking people to accept these appointments. And that I also wonder is, people have been said, we're putting you on. How much do they say, I really want to do this, or, okay, I'll accept this?
Yeah.
How active are
It's
they?
interesting because I have had a couple potential appointees reach out and ask some of those questions, like how impactful do you think this task force is going to be? Is this worth my time? What kind of time investment do you think this is going to be? Because we've been involved in this conversation. So
Sure.
we talk with, we talk with folks in the education community all the time. So I think it has the potential to be very impactful. I mean, like you said, this is not a nibble around the edges sort of effort. It's a moonshot effort. They could miss the moon. That certainly could happen. But
Right.
it is the type of energy behind this is a moonshot level of energy. And so we have a chance to really transform the state's education system in a meaningful way. What is that going to look like? Those are still all questions that are unanswered, obviously, but this is a serious effort. This is going to take a lot of time and commitment from these task force members. And
I applaud that. I applaud the fact that they are willing to bite the bullet, and they're going to be, attacked regardless of their position, no matter how wonderful, or just because they're
Right.
thinking. People get attacked because they vocalize their thoughts, and that's what they're supposed to do. So I applaud the fact that they're all coming out and they're going to begin the conversation, and they can start, 10 angry men, right? They can start in one place and end up in an entirely different place. But I think that deep down, they're sincere, and their goal is individually and all together to
Yeah.
reform the system. I think they all accept the fact that it's needed. So we are coming to the close. So I want to hear from you. Anything you want to throw out here now before we ask you to come back and we invite our task force members to
Yeah,
join?
I think that we definitely are going to be excited. Some of them we know, some of those task force members we know quite a bit about. Others we don't know a lot about, and so it'll be interesting to see how they all work together, what the balance is struck. But I think I'm optimistic about the makeup of the task force and the fact that no one set of interests is going to control it necessarily. So like there could be a coalition that forms between different interest groups, but I think that there's in general much more balance than previous efforts, and I think that's encouraging. I would also say that we'll be watching very closely as those conversations unfold and making sure that we're not needlessly giving up. I think for us, the biggest concern is we want to achieve cost savings, but achieve cost savings without giving up those community ties that schools have. And also following the data to tell us where the cost savings actually are, as opposed to just this mindset of like, and maybe this is just a manifestation of us being 21st century Americans, but thinking bigger is better all the time. And that's not necessarily the case. Better is better. And so we should be focusing on the things that that the data tells us are actually going to improve our situation.
Well, I thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to this further and bigger conversation. And I know that we want pupil outcomes to be beneficial. We want our students to also want to go to school, and that is so important. So I want to thank you so much, Ben, and I can't wait for the next episode of Straight Talk Vermont, where we get it straight. Thank you, NEK-TV, and we will see you next week.